The aim of our video is to talk about the common adult relationship difficulties and how Relate counsellors have supported families with adopted children. They've come to us because they were struggling with their relationships, and so that's something that we were really able to help with. We're not just going to talk about the challenges of adoption, but we'll highlight some of the simple things that those families have told us and what we've learned from the work we've done and how other people can help to get through these difficult periods. Every family is going to go through a difficult phase at times, and families who adopt are no different. But research shows us that 80% of them are positive about the future. What we've done is broken the conversation down into some key areas. In the first section, we're going to talk generally about relationships, and then we'll talk more specifically about relationships in adoptive families. We'll cover some of the common feelings that can affect a relationship and some tips for sharing feelings and differences in your parenting approaches and some ideas for how you can work together more collaboratively. We'll talk about how it's really important for any couple to sort of make time for themselves and their relationship. And in the last part, we're going to talk about what Relate does and what we can offer as a counselling service. I think firstly, we're going to talk about healthy couple relationships, aren't we? And that will be sort of something that will help everybody in whatever relationship they're in and whatever their situation is. So everyone has different ideas about what makes a good relationship. And what are your thoughts as a professional relationship counsellor about what those might be?
I think one of the key things is that in a healthy adult relationship, we can trust that our partner is committed to be there for us when times are hard. And also that we feel connected to them emotionally and physically. We feel understood and able to understand our partner. And of course, there may be differences, but these can be discussed and you can work together through shared values to find a way forward.
That's a really interesting thing you said then about being there for each other in difficult times, because I think that's often the problem, isn't it? If you're going through a difficult time and you're both going through it, it can be quite hard to support each other, can't it? Because you're the one who wants support, so giving it is difficult. Yeah.
Yes, interestingly, there was a survey that Relate did fairly recently, and it was a large-scale survey. There were 5,000 people who asked to contribute, and they said that the top key factors were trust, communication, commitment, and shared values.
That's quite interesting, isn't it? Yeah, and that trust that someone's there for you is really important.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. What does research tell us that healthy couples do? I mean, what is it about a healthy relationship that makes it a healthy relationship?
Yes. Well, interestingly, what is a healthy relationship between two intimate partners has a lot of similarities to what any healthy relationship might look like, and similarities to what a child needs from
their parents and from the adults in their life.
Yes. Yeah. So, but particularly in adult relationships, it's the ability to soothe yourself and each other. That's one of the things that will happen in a healthy relationship. And even though things are wrong and things might feel negative, they stay engaged. They can sort out their differences without blaming each other. They stay emotionally engaged. And when there's been tension, they will reach out to reconnect. And the other thing that research tells us is that very often, not ignoring the negatives, but there will also be a focus on the positives.
So yes, sometimes the relationship, if things are difficult, it can become quite easy to focus on the negatives, can't it? To become quite saturated in problem saturated and not look at the good bits that are there, even if they're quite small good bits.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes one of the things that I might be talking to our clients about, is the tendency to kind of have negative glasses on. So sometimes when things are going badly, people might completely ignore the good stuff that's happening, and it can take a while to actually feel safe enough to take those negative glasses off and see what the reality is.
No, that's very true. What is it that's, why is it important that we prioritize our relationships? Because I think especially if you're talking in a family context, it can be quite easy, can't it, for couples to say, oh, we haven't got time for that. We're busy with the children, we're busy with work and all this stuff. Why is it important that we prioritize our relationships?
Wow. This is something that I think it's really only the last decade or two that we've really started to get a good understanding of just how important it is, because relationships are absolutely central to our health and our well-being. Good quality relationships reduce our experiences, our capacity to experience ill health.
Yeah, we know that from some research, don't we, that that's a really important thing, for people to have that support around them and those good quality relationships.
For instance, when people are recovering from surgery, if they're in a good quality relationship, they will recover faster. And I think for adopted parents who have adopted, nobody is more aware that healthy relationships are vital for children and their outcomes than parents who adopt.
And it's that thing, isn't it, about if you sort of neglect that central relationship, when we say about parents saying, I haven't got time to do this. I know I've sometimes said to families, and to couples, it's a bit like your house, isn't it? If you spend all your time up in the roof checking that the slates are all right, but no one's worrying about the foundations, it might all fall down anyway. And whether you've got a decent roof or not becomes irrelevant. And I think you can see the couple relationship as that foundation that's underpinning the family a lot of the time, isn't it?
Completely agree. And again, one of the things that research tells us is that the better the quality of the relationship between the parents, the better very often is the relationship between the parents and the children.
So the whole family dynamics is much more positive.
And that can be difficult when, especially nowadays, maybe we're homeschooling, we're struggling demands of work and home. But certainly one of the best things parents can do for children is to prioritize their couple relationship. The couple relationship quality is an important factor in children's well-being and development. We have run courses for parents in the past, and one of the things that parents might say is, well, there just isn't time for me. And one of the kind of metaphors that we might use is to think about what happens on an aeroplane. Who puts the oxygen mask on first?
That's very true, isn't it?
It's the adults, because the adults need to take care of themselves, to take care of the
children and the family
they're responsible for.
That's a really good analogy, that, isn't it? I've always sat there on an aeroplane when they're saying that and thinking, I hope if it ever comes to it, I do what I've been told, because I guess the temptation as a parent would be so great to start fiddling about with your child and making them safe, wouldn't it? But it's absolutely true. If a couple have sort of a good relationship and they've been through a lot of problems, and we know that some adoptive families have obviously been through IVF and the adoption process, which is really tough in itself, does that mean that they'll be more able to cope with anything? They've dealt with all that, so therefore it should all be plain sailing from then on, shouldn't it, sort of thing?
Well, of course, having successfully been through problems, obviously those couples will have a good foundation to cope with future problems because they will have learned a lot of strategies and
Yeah.
developed a lot of skills. But we do know that families that have adopted, 56% have felt that they have faced very significant challenges. And also just thinking generally, no relationship ever remains the same. And it's not unusual for relationships to be stressed by, the normal transitions such as becoming a family. And as couple relationships develop, every stage can bring its own issues that can stress the relationship. And we certainly
the stresses you've had before will be different to the stresses you're going to have in the future. And so, as you say, there may be some coping strategies. And sometimes that's what you need to take time to think, isn't it? How did I cope with a similar situation before? How can I use those strategies in this situation now?
Yeah. And becoming a parent, we know, can be a very stressful time. It's ranked alongside bereavement and moving house as one of the most stressful life events. I mean, it can be full of such joy and happiness, but let's remember it can also be very, very challenging and a significant challenge for many couple relationships. And we know from working with couples and from the research, it can lead to a reduction very commonly in relationship quality and satisfaction. And that's absolutely normal. But I guess the important thing is to recognize what's happening so that you can take steps to reconnect. And certainly the work with the couples that we've worked with who've adopted has shown that even the very best of relationships can reach a point where everyone feels stuck and hopeless about coping with a difficult situation. None of us can be sure how we'll react to new circumstances. And we do know that adoptive parents are especially resourceful and resilient and usually have experience of having to come through often quite big problems in the past. Often the problem, of course, is there's so much going on when becoming a family that the couple relationship goes on the back burner.
Yes. Yeah.
So little time left.
Yeah.
And, the other thing is that it's often really evident is if the couple relationship deteriorates, then what happens? It's very common for the behaviour of the children to become more difficult.
Yes, that's very true, isn't it? They pick up really, really quickly on very small things and differences going on between their parents and any stresses. Yeah. So all relationships are going to have ups and downs, aren't they? What do you think are the risks when relationships are under stress? Because I sometimes think that's one of the things people often ask about. When do I go to relationship counselling? And again, there's ups and downs. So you're not going to want to go every time there's a down, but it's recognising when those downs are becoming more than just a flowing thing, isn't it? When the stresses are really kicking in, and what might they be?
Well, very often. Well, it's obviously different for every individual. So for many individuals, it might even look like a real dip in their mood. They might have difficulty sleeping. They might change their eating pattern. They might have difficulty concentrating. All those signs of stress.
So those signs of sort of depression and anxiety that people might have, start to come through. Yeah.
And to the extent too that we know that relationship stress has such a profound impact that increases the risk of heart attack and high blood pressure, and in itself increases the risk of depression and anxiety.
So it's a bit of a circular thing, isn't it? Is the anxiety and depression causing problems in the relationship? Is the relationship exacerbating that? And that's often quite hard to unpick, isn't it, really, for people?
Yes. And certainly for couples, relationship stress can push couples into negative patterns that also perpetuate problems instead of getting them sorted out.
Yeah.
It might not be about arguing, but about perhaps withdrawing for each other and not speaking. And it might be hostile tension. The kind of thing where you walk in the room, you could cut the knife.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's equally hard for young people to be
Yes,
living with.
that atmosphere. And I think that's true. It's interesting when you get people, and you probably had that in the counselling room, and I certainly have, where people have come and said, we don't argue, as though that's a good thing. And actually, it isn't the arguing or disagreeing, it's how those arguments happen. But yeah, that tension and that lack of discussion or communication can be quite toxic, and especially for children, can't it, to live with that? Yeah.
Absolutely. And of course, that's how children learn how to communicate. By watching their parents. There's a risk, if they're exposed to an unhelpful way of resolving differences, that they start to do the same thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Not just with how they argue with their parents, but actually also what they do with their siblings.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It's interesting sometimes. I remember, hearing people, you hear people sometimes swear at their children, and then sort of with the next breath say, I don't know where they've learnt that language from. And it's, well, they've learnt it from you, because that's the way you're interacting in this environment. So yeah, it's very true. It's sometimes parents expect children to do what we tell them, but actually they're learning by what they see we do.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, however the conflict is expressed, it's always stressful for children. And I think sometimes it's when adults are themselves so overwhelmed with their own emotions, sometimes it can be overlooked just how difficult it can be for children. I'm sure you've had the experience too of perhaps we might have someone that comes to us for family counselling because the children are acting up, and it becomes
quite apparent. Yeah,
apparent. Actually, it's the couple that we need to work with.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
And of course, for adopted children, I guess just reflecting on the importance of them having stability and security, it's particularly important to keep that secure base for them.
Yeah. They may be quite hypersensitive to stress, more so, mightn't they, because of the past experiences that they're bringing with them into the family. Yeah.
Yes. And very almost programmed to be looking out for threat all the time.
Yeah, that's right. So they're very, very astute at picking up on it.
Yes.
Also, yeah.
Very, very sensitive.
Yeah. Before we sort of think more about the adoptive family, I'm just thinking about couples generally with children. What are the main issues, I'm wondering, that couples struggle with? What brings them to seek counselling support, really?
Well, every couple's different, of course, but there are all the usual reasons that couples seek counselling. Feeling disconnected, feeling unsupported, feeling unheard, not being able to sort out their differences. New parents, of course, typically spend less time with their partner.
Yeah.
We know that they're likely to engage in less positive interactions. We know that they're likely to argue more. The more differences are likely to emerge. I think the issues for this group tend to be mainly about communication, time together, different parenting styles, and sex, of course.
Yeah, that lack of time for that. And the difference in parenting styles is quite interesting, isn't it? Because I think for couples, you meet someone, you live with them, you meet them as an adult, and then when you introduce a child into the family, it's the first time sometimes that you really engage with memories from your own childhood and how things are done. And I can remember that, being very conscious about, well, this is the way we did it in my family when I was a child, and my husband saying, well, in my family we did it this way when I was a child. And I'm thinking, blimey, it's really quite different. But I wasn't there in his childhood and he wasn't there in mine, and so we didn't have that experience really until then.
And I suppose the other thing, thinking about what you were saying there, is we don't often tell our stories about our past and our parenting until we actually come to experience being a parent ourselves. And of course, parents who adopt, they're not immune from all the problems that other couples have.
No.
Who may have thought of splitting up. But the thought of splitting up after adopting seems to bring such extra distress, because nobody wants children who've already been through the trauma of losing their parents to experience more difficulties.
Yes. So there's almost an extra sort of stress that you have, that you know, I mean, as you say, no couple really wants to split up and disrupt a family situation. But if you've adopted, there's an extra layer almost, isn't there, of really have got to make this work. And then, of course, the more pressure you put on something, the harder it can feel. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I think or should I say many couples or many individuals, there might be times that they think to themselves, I can't cope with this. Life might be different if I wasn't in this relationship or we hadn't had children. And that's just a passing thought, and it goes. But I think sometimes, perhaps for adopted parents, that thought panics them. And it can feel much bigger than just a passing thought.
It can start to catastrophize a bit, can't it, I suppose? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, one father said to me that he just could not take in his wife having an affair. He just couldn't get his head around it. He thought becoming a family had made their world absolutely perfect, and I felt it was all blown apart, and everyone was going to be damaged. And it was just such a catastrophe, it felt, for him. But that couple, they stayed together and they worked on the problems that had developed. I mean, it was a long road working through all those feelings and making sense of what was happening in the relationship that contributed to the affair. But one of the problems that was identified was the couple hadn't been open with each other about their feelings about becoming parents.
So that lack of communication was at the base of it, and what you then were dealing with was the affair and other things that had come after. But communication and lack of talking about your feelings was really underlying a lot of that. Yeah.
Shall I ask you a question?
Okay, you can ask me a question then. We're going to talk about adoptive parents and some of the feelings that affect relationships. Yeah. So what did you want to ask me?
Well, you've worked a lot with families who've adopted, adoptive families. What do you think are the main issues?
They've often sort of felt that they've been through such a rigorous process, and that's taken its toll, hasn't it? And so, you know, they've then got that to deal with, and that they feel very much that they can't show any weakness. I think that's something we've come across, that, you know, they've got to show that they can provide this safe, secure home. And so it can be really hard to admit that things are difficult. And I think, you know, it's probably a neglected area, isn't it? And especially if you say you have a child that's a bit older, you know, there's a lot around about, oh, a newborn's going to be difficult, sleepless nights, but oh, you've got a child that's 8 or 9 months old, it should be in a routine, and, you know, you shouldn't be struggling. And so it's hard. They feel like they need to be the perfect parent and solve all the problems. So I think that can be hard to share those feelings, that you're not coping that well, even perhaps with your partner. And I think that all parents have expectations, don't they? That it's all going to be lovely and the baby's going to sleep in this wonderful cot you've got for it and all this stuff. But actually, I think there's, you know, the same for adoptive parents. They've built up a view of what it will be like, a fantasy. And so it's not just parents who've given birth who can experience depression after becoming a parent. You know, it's thought that perhaps up to 30% of adoptive parents can experience depression, and that can be a hard thing to admit to when everyone's expecting you to, they're sort of looking at you saying, well, you've got what you've wanted, you've got what this, the whole long road has brought you to this, so you should be happy now. And actually that's, you know, it is important to recognize if your mood's low. It's important to seek help and to speak to your GP if you think that will be
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah because how do you think that, you know, that can affect a couple relationship, sort of things like depression and anxiety and things? What do we see around that?
I think the problem is very often, well, firstly, I think the problem is acknowledging it to themselves. Certainly worked with many people who haven't really done that. They haven't really faced what they're feeling in themselves until they've had that conversation with the counsellor. But the problem is that very often all those feelings are known, but they're not shared. They're not shared with their partner, or, well, problematically, they're not shared in a helpful way. They're shared in an unhelpful and a blaming way.
A blaming way, yeah. And I think actually sometimes for a partner, if you pick up that your partner is not coping well, you can feel responsible. You know, what am I doing that's making them unhappy? Why are they unhappy? What can I do? And actually it is about normalizing and accepting that sometimes you do need external help with some of these difficulties, and it's not anyone's fault, it's just how it is, really. But
the problem is that the feelings of the unaffected partner who doesn't really understand what's happening can often turn to resentment, especially if they haven't experienced any of those feelings themselves. It's much harder to work out what's going on.
You can feel quite excluded from it, can't you? I think.
Yes. And thinking about being excluded, I mean, if one's struggling emotionally and none of this is shared, that kind of creates a wall, a barrier between the couple. Sometimes a partner can become withdrawn, and inevitably that leads to, well, what's it lead to? Breakdown of communication, misunderstandings, assumptions. It could all lead to...
And lack of time together, because people start to avoid spending time together, don't they? They withdraw and they don't have that positive time that reconnects them.
Well, it can even get to the point where it's not just making time to be together, it can be uncomfortable even being in the same room.
And then of course we're thinking, you know, going back to what we said earlier about the children that are experiencing that and see this disconnect happening. What sort of feelings might a parent who adopts struggle with?
Commonly, the parents that we've worked with talk about feelings of guilt, anxiety, depression, isolation, fear of judgment, and sheer exhaustion were very common in many of the parents that we've worked with. There may be sadness. Old wounds can reopen when the child comes into a family. Bringing a child into a home can sort of stir up grief about being unable to have a biological child, or it might revive painful childhood memories that they thought had been resolved, but they've been hooked into again.
It really re-triggers our own childhoods for us, doesn't it, when we become parents? And I think that's something that we don't always anticipate, because we might have forgotten lots of things and they really come back, don't they, when you're suddenly a parent?
Absolutely. And that's for all parents, whether you it's a biological child, an adopted child. It's very, very common for forgotten memories to be re-triggered. But we
being able to share those is what's important, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the best ways of resolving troubled memories. But if they remain and you're still struggling with it, it's really important to get professional help with processing what's come up. It's getting in the way of how you are as a couple, how you are as a family, how you're living your life. Again, it's about importance of seeking some professional help.
Yeah. And I suppose thinking about where those feelings might have come from, you know, as we said before, you know, there's a lot of pressure to be perfect, to provide this perfect home. And one of the things I think we've come across is that unacknowledged fact that it can be difficult to bond sometimes with children first. And I think, you know, lots of people who have given birth to a child say that they don't always bond straight away. And it's, you know, that can then lead you to sort of feeling that it's only you going through this and you don't feel confident as a parent. And sometimes it is just normalizing that, you know, the connection will grow at its own pace, won't it? You know, and being too anxious about that bond can affect it as well. Have you had any sort of experience of anyone who's sort of really struggled with that?
Do you know, I can think of a woman who told Misha how much she was struggling with feelings of guilt, that their child had been through difficult experiences in the past. And I remember her saying there was something about becoming a parent that made her feel responsible for everything.
Right.
You know, even the things that happened before she met him.
Right, yeah.
I know it makes no sense, she said.
Yeah.
And she felt very different from her husband. Whereas she was struggling with feelings of guilt, her husband's response was actually to feel really angry,
right,
about the experiences that their daughter had been through. So actually they were on very different places with their feelings.
They were probably feeling the same sort of things, but expressing them in different ways, weren't they? Yeah, yeah. That's very true.
Yes.
What are some of the pressures that might make adoptive parenting extra difficult?
Many children have been adopted, have experienced abuse or neglect.
Mm-hmm. So like this woman that you spoke about, there's a past that you have you are now dealing with in the present, isn't there? Yeah.
I mean, certainly all have experienced the trauma of losing a birth family, and many will have been in care at some point. And over time, the extent of the child's difficulties may become more apparent as the child grows, and maybe behaviours can become more and more challenging, and the reserves required of a parent to cope with this can become increasingly depleted. So the kind of problems parents were dealing with, we were hearing about, were aggression, ADHD, autism, and obviously meeting the needs of these young people can be exhausting. And it's not just physically exhausting, but it can be emotionally draining too.
As well. Yeah.
Parents can start to feel that nothing they do seems to help, and they feel inadequate, and often also really sad, especially if professionals recognise that there is a new problem, and so there's a new diagnosis. It can start to feel really difficult.
Parenting is like that, isn't it? I mean, I could remember reading a book about potty training, and I thought, you get the potty out, you take the nappy off, and it works. And actually, you know, there's a repetitiveness about parenting, isn't there? And it's the same about behaviour. And I think sometimes you can feel very judged, you know, the tantrum in the supermarket, that people will look at you and just tell your child to stop, and they will. And it's not like that. It's not just one, you say it once and it works. There's a long journey of instilling those things and dealing with problems and issues and finding the best way to deal with them, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think particularly with the kind of problems that we're talking about here, and you know, on top of the difficulties that children have experienced earlier on, and I will talk about this later, but I think it's worth saying again anyway that, you know, often what you might think of as kind of traditional parenting, or the sort of strategies that everyone assumes are needed, actually it might need a different kind of approach. So people can be judgmental.
And it's very much so, isn't it? I mean, we talked earlier about, you know, changes, and I think there's been lots of changes in research and things in the last few years that have taught us things, and other generations might still be in a different place and be saying, well, just send them to their bedroom, tell them this or do that. And actually, it isn't really that simple. You know, you've got to work quite hard to find the best way to parent when there's been some trauma around before, haven't you?
Yeah. Absolutely. But do you know what? I would say, you know, sometimes I work with couples that haven't got children, but couples who have it in their heads that actually relationships should always be easy. There's never a problem. We shouldn't have to work at it.
And it's not.
It's not, no.
Yeah.
So it's whether we're going to be a successful couple. It takes commitment and effort.
Yeah.
And the same for being a successful family. It's not giving up, isn't it? But I mean, I guess one of the other feelings that adoptive parents have described is sometimes feeling a bit of anger, feeling trapped because they felt, actually, we didn't sign up for this. We hadn't expected it to be quite
we didn't expect it to be this difficult.
Yeah. And the other thing is, there might be perhaps differences in what each is contributing to the parenting. And one
person can feel resentful that they're doing more of that stuff.
Yes.
And it's different, isn't it? And I think sometimes one person might do more emotional parenting and the other might do more physical parenting, and they're hard to compare, aren't they? Because you know, they're different. So we're going to talk a bit about working together as adoptive parents, because I think that's a really important thing, isn't it? How people work together. But I suppose it's useful to think about, you know, that's true for any parents, isn't it? What are the specific common problems for new parents generally, and what do they need to do to make sure they work together? And then perhaps move on to some more specifics about adoptive parents. I mean, it's a big change for a relationship, isn't it? Having children, becoming a family. You know, we see that a lot, don't we? It changes. You lose that freedom. You had all the time in the world to do stuff before, and suddenly you don't. So, but I suppose what's different, I suppose perhaps, is that you suddenly can be thrust into it as an adoptive parent, can't you? It's not a sort of 9-month getting used to it. And so it can be quite quick. I mean, although they've gone through the process, the actual when it happens can be quite quick, can't it? Suddenly you've got a child and you've got to adjust everything overnight.
Yes. I think it can be quite breathtaking, and I think the time needed for everyone to sort of settle into new ways of living together can actually take a bit longer than they anticipated. Juggling your child's needs with your own, that's part of adapting to a new identity. Yourself as an individual, however much that has been longed for. That can be difficult. So it's important to spend some time thinking about actually how what you need for yourself. Not ignoring your own needs. As well as, of course, thinking about
the couple needs as well. You've got another layer, haven't you? Yourself, the couple, and now the child and the family. I think I mean, I can remember myself thinking about that. Suddenly when you're a parent, you look at the world in a different way, don't you? And you suddenly realize that there's all those dangers out there, and you're worried about someone else, not just yourself, really. And that can be quite a realization, can't it? So quite acute.
I mean, I have a good friend who was a pediatric nurse. So obviously she was absolutely comfortable with looking after children. And when she brought her first child home,
yeah, it was a shock.
Said help.
And she knew all the dangers that might mean that
Yes.
the child ended up in hospital, I guess. So yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And it can becoming a parent can stir up all sorts of emotions. I mean, I guess for parents who adopt, a lot of, you'll have been through so much preparation already with your social worker. But in actual fact, that moment of the child coming in, actually, the reality of the responsibilities can still lead to a sense of feeling unprepared. And certainly if one parent is doing most of the caring, they can find themselves struggling with a whole range of emotions. And I guess what we were saying before about identity, and especially if they've changed their working patterns, or perhaps stop work completely.
Yes.
To give more childcare. There's a lot going on there to process, and
a lot of change all at once, isn't there? Really, you know, there's the change of what you've lost, and then also the change about what you've gained, and with the good that you've gained, there's also going to come some difficult things. What do you see as the parenting problems that are even more specific to adoptive parents? You know, whatever the age of the child that is brought into the relationship, it's going to change the dynamic, isn't it? That's going to be whether it's a baby or whether it's an older child. It's suddenly going to change things, isn't it?
Well, I think all of the things we've just been talking about, but perhaps even more so, they can be a bit more exaggerated. Adoption often requires there needs to be even more thought and time given to how to meet a child's needs and how to balance work and home. Whatever the age of the child that comes into the home, the couple relationship, it's going to change the dynamic between the couple. And there's always going to be some unexpected issues. And as we said before, all change can be stressful, even much wanted change, and can put the relationship under unexpected stress. I think the other thing is, if life does become much harder and perhaps one parent was actually a bit more committed than the other, this can lead to a bit of resentment and tension between the couple. Again, especially if one feels the other isn't pulling their weight. Or the other might be having thoughts, regretting the decision to adopt.
It's quite difficult, isn't it, for couples, you know, when we talk about being equally committed. I think that, you know, it's quite different. People often do have different levels of commitment to something. And it's quite hard to often tease that out about what is someone doing to please the other, when is someone quite easygoing about something, when are they perhaps not that engaged in it, but they're happy to let their partner do it. And that stuff can suddenly come to a head at that time, can't it? And it can be really difficult, to meet the needs of the child if you're also feeling resentful towards somebody at the same.
I mean, quite a common theme we had was also, and that can be related to perhaps a different level of commitment. Might all be differences about the best way to parent. So one parent might have been to all the classes. They might have done, you know, the therapeutic parenting classes, and they've learned a lot about attachment and trauma, and if they've actually been the one that's done all that work and the other one hasn't, and perhaps maybe relying on some information.
You can go and do it and you can tell me afterwards. Yes.
Yes.
Right.
They can end up with very different ideas about how to parent. And
picking up on what you said then about trauma, it's quite important, isn't it, that, we recognise that some of these children who've been adopted will have had trauma in their lives before. And, it is important that parents are quite aware about the impact of trauma and what that might lead to. So, you know, what do people need to know about trauma? How informed do they need to be before becoming adoptive parents, do you think?
I think there's a really good book called Parenting the Child Who Hurts.
Right.
And there's a paragraph in there. In fact, it's so good, I'm going to read it. Okay, when a child who's been traumatized enters a family, either for foster care or adoption, they bring a lot with them. Much of what they bring may not be expected by the family. And even more importantly, it is almost certain that the family, parents and children, will not expect the child's emotions and experiences to have a negative or even traumatic impact. Hurt children bring their many hurts with them, and often both parents and other children in the family feel as if they're now living in an environment that's both traumatic and hurtful. And although that sounds a bit scary, I think what has really shone out in the work that we've done with parents who've adopted is they've come through that. They so much want to offer a loving and stable home, and they can understand the importance of and the difficulties of doing everything that they can to provide that stability. But it's just so important to remember that it is,
I suppose, to manage in those situations, you need to understand, don't you? As you say, that paragraph can sound quite scary. It's spilling out into the family, and but actually understanding that and understanding that that's what's happening can help you sort of get an understanding of what's happening and recognize the fears that might be there for the child that's underlying their behavior. And I think only when we understand and can talk about these things can we sort of reduce the anxiety, emotional distress, and keep calm about it, because we need to have time to reflect, don't we, rather than react to those sort of situations. And I think if people react too quickly without reflecting on it, that's when the temperature can rise and the whole thing can escalate, can't it? So there's something there, isn't there, about understanding the sort of neurological impact of the past upon that adopted child, because it's, you know, it's not, and it's distinguishing the child from the behavior, isn't it? You know, this behavior is happening because of what's gone before, and so because you want, I mean, I'm wondering how that can affect the way parents feel about their adopted child sometimes when these behaviors come out. It can be quite difficult, can't it, for them sometimes?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of difficulties. I mean, you were talking there about the neurological impact. So sometimes these young people, I mean, their brains will be wired to look for trauma, to look for potentially painful or frightening experiences. So they will be hyper attuned, as we were talking before.
Yes, that vigilance about it.
Yes, the amygdala, the warning part of the brain will be often on high alert. So they come into the family with all their stress systems activated. They've actually learned, and it's a survival strategy, don't trust. It's not safe.
It's not safe.
Yes. It's, you know, their strategy has been actually to try to keep others away from harming them. They've learned to keep themselves safe by focusing on any potential signs of anger or negativity in other people. And what do people do when they're when they're stressed, when they think they're under threat? That isn't a calm emotion. That isn't an emotion that's inviting others to connect with you.
And you saying that about their program to keep people at a distance, that can feel for an adoptive parent that they're being rejected by that child, can't
Yes,
it? Yeah. So it's quite hard to keep offering out your caring feelings to this
absolutely.
child that seems to be rejecting you. So it is really important, isn't it, for a couple, you know, and for the whole family to understand together what's happening. You know, so do you find that often in the couples we've worked with, you know, recently, that one person might find that more difficult than the other? Is it
Very
something?
often, yes, and often
Yeah.
that is connected with perhaps their own parent experiences of being parented.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
think this is I mean, of course there are people who adopt who are single parents, but actually what we're focusing on is when people adopt and actually
in that couple relationship.
couple adopt. Yes.
Yeah.
I think one of the strengths for a couple will be that actually they can support each other with those, with difficult feelings that might emerge. They can help calm their partner who might be you know, perhaps reacting defensively or getting impatient or feeling hopeless. If their partner can soothe them and be compassionate and supportive and hopeful,
Yes. Yeah.
that can make such a difference. And also, I think the other thing is in those situations, and again, it's, you know, because obviously we work as well with a lot of parents who haven't adopted but might have children who have, you know, might be on the autistic spectrum or have ADHD or all those
extra needs that can make
extra
things.
needs that
Yeah.
children have.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's really important is to make time for some self-care. And in a couple relationship, one of the most loving things that a partner can do is to make that possible, is to support your partner to have some time for themselves to recharge.
And that comes back to what we talked about earlier about the communication and being able to talk to each other and reach out for help and not get into a blaming culture, really, isn't it? Focusing a bit on the child and how that, you know, the dynamics that might start to happen in the family. It's really important, isn't it, that, you know, that parents accept themselves and each other as a good enough parent and not blaming each other when you know, they see that they're struggling, and not blaming yourself if there's some challenging behaviors that are going on. As I say, you know, it's not a, you know, you don't tell your child not to do something and they never do it again and everything's wonderful. You know, challenges are there in parenting all the way through, aren't they? And that's a natural way of the world, isn't it? I mean, certainly as children get older and grow up into teenagers, they need to challenge because they need to develop their own sense of self. And so, yeah, it's about not having that blame, isn't it? And being able to.
I think also, inevitably, there will be times when, you know, you will misunderstand, or perhaps you feel, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, I've got it wrong, but that's okay. The important thing is to recognize that actually there's been a rupture in the relationship, and to find a way to repair that. A bit like what we were saying about couple relationships. One of the important things is repair.
Is repair and recognizing. I think something somebody told me years ago when I became a parent was about your children. Whatever you do, you know, you can only be a good enough parent, and your children will always have criticisms. And when they come to you and criticize something, it's really important to be able to hear that criticism, because we all have different experiences. And so rather than defending, you know, why you made them carry on the music lessons they didn't want to do or go and learn to swim or whatever, it's about being able to hold up your hands sometimes and say, I'm sorry you experienced it like that. I did what I thought was best at the time, but I might do it differently now if I had that time again, you know. So I think that's really important, isn't it? Thinking about respite, I mean, what we said about self-care and respite, that's something we've heard a lot, isn't it, that for adoptive parents it can be quite hard to get that respite. You know, they might not have family and friends who understand, and they're also worried about, you know, sort of burdening other people with their problems, aren't they? And that, going back to that asking for help thing. So I think that's a really important thing, to use your support systems, even if it is for small bits of respite. You know, it may not be achievable to go away for a whole weekend, but it may be achievable to get out for a cup of coffee together on a Saturday morning for half an hour, and be realistic and do seek that. It's really important to nurture yourself and the relationship, I think, isn't it? We've touched on that earlier, but I think that's a big important fact too.
Do you think it's true to say investment in the family can sometimes mean that the individual and the couple are not invested in?
Yes, absolutely. I think it can be all too easy to not feel you've got enough time for A, yourself, or B, the relationship. And it's certainly true. I mean, children are important. Somebody once said to me that it's really important that children are a part of your world, but not the centre of it. And I thought, you know, that made me think a bit, but I think that's quite important, really. I think children need to feel they're part of everything, but if they feel that they're too much the centre, and that cannot be a good thing, really. And I think it is important for people to have an all-round view, and invest in all parts of the family, and the individual and the couple are all those parts of it, aren't they? And I think that, you know, there are parenting issues that are just that, they're parenting issues. All couples will have them, and they need to be able to tackle those constructively together. And if you've not invested in your couple relationship and not got the communication there, it's difficult to then deal with the difficulties when they come. One of the things I think we found with adoptive families is, as we said before, that they can find it hard to sometimes get babysitters to have that time out. You know, there might be quite a lot of attachment issues that mean that it is quite difficult to get that child to sleep in their own bed, to have, you know, to have that routine and things. And we have certainly heard people, haven't we, say that when they've had some time out together, it's quite hard to come back. And that's been really difficult for them to recognise that actually they found it hard to then switch back into the dynamics of the family life, you know, and it's brought at home.
So, I mean, what thoughts have you got about how adults experience this kind of snatch time for themselves?
I think it is important to think about small things. You know, if we start to think about a weekend away in Paris, that becomes just too big, doesn't it? You know, so just putting some time in the diary, whether it's having a walk alone. You know, sometimes people can get into splitting the chores, so they're always doing different things at different times. And, you know, maybe, you know, both of you taking the children to the swimming lesson and having a coffee while they're swimming, rather than saying, you do swimming, I'll do the shopping. You know, that can give you half an hour while they're in the pool having their swimming lesson, whatever it is. It's, you know, it is just as well thinking, you know, are we going to just flop on the lounge tonight and watch the telly, or shall we just spend 10 minutes talking about our day before we switch the television on? You know, those little things. And time together doesn't, you know, have to be, as we say, outside the home, weekends away. It can just be small things. I mean, you know, when you come home from work, when you finish your day's work, just having a kiss and connecting about the day, you know, just, you know, having a cup of tea together, whatever. And I think that if people are finding that intimacy and time for sex is just feels way off the agenda, you know, still acknowledge that, because I think the biggest danger is when people are avoiding it. So out there, say, yeah, we're too tired to have sex, but let's sit and hold hands watching telly. Let's still enjoy some touch without there being any fear that this is going to go any further. Because I think that when it's not talked about, it's dangerous, really.
Absolutely. And I think It's not about being indulgent, finding that time. It's what has to happen for the survival of the relationship. Think of it as survival time.
Yes.
Um, if a relationship is like a plant,
Yeah.
it's got to be fed and it's got to be watered.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
And that is so important. And also, again, I mean, back to what we were saying right at the beginning, it's so important that the children get a good picture of what a healthy relationship looks like, and that includes
seeing their parents spend some time together, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
And it does, you know, if you're trying to spend some time together and the child interrupts you, you know, it is okay to say, just wait 5 minutes. You know, you don't have to drop everything all the time.
Yes.
What's important is that when you finish that time, you do go back to the child and say, right, okay, I'm now ready for what it is that you wanted to show me, talk to me about, or whatever. It's making sure that you are trustworthy in that. If you say to somebody, hang on a minute, then you do go back to them. That's what's important, setting the boundaries and being true to them, I think. And people often feel very worried, especially with an adoptive child, of rejecting them in any way. But it's about handling that in the best possible way and letting them know that their time will be there and you will acknowledge them and you won't, it's not a rejection, it's just a pause for a minute. What about talking about your differences? You know, how do people find time to do that? Because I think there's a real interesting thing we often find, that people who've got problems going on, where they'll argue about them, but they often don't find the time to talk about them in a rational way when things are calmer. Because if things are calmer and going well, you don't want to rock the boat often, really. So, you know, what are some good tips to help couples find the time or find the ability to talk to each other about difficult things?
Well, I think the first tip is absolutely what you were saying, not to be firing off everything you think is wrong when you are annoyed with your partner, but to be actually really trying to soothe yourself, and not to react to a disagreement by making lots of accusations, because actually that's just going to add another problem to the relationship. Often what happens with couples is they end up arguing about the way they argue.
Yes. And it becomes very much, rather than about the issue, about you always do this, you always say that, you're always this or that. Yes. What can people do to stop that then? How can they speak during an argument?
Yeah. So the first thing is to recognize that actually it is so easy to get into a negative cycle. And maybe actually both of you want to, you know, maybe one of you wants to feel connected and heard, and the other's feeling attacked and criticizing and just trying to protect themselves. So actually, at heart, maybe the two of you are actually really wanting to sort things out, but what happens is it makes things worse. So the first thing to do is to learn to soothe yourself. But I think one of the things that the research shows is that successful couples will introduce the need to talk in a gentle way. They'll, before they even start on what's wrong, they'll actually be flagging up, it'd be really good if we could have a chat. Yes. And negotiating when to chat. Not, it's got to be now.
No, when is a good time, because we need to do this. Yeah. And the way people sort of talk as well. I mean, the use of I statements is really important, isn't it? So,
I mean, it can feel a bit clinical. I statements is something that's taught in on assertiveness courses. But again, it is a way of getting your point across that can work because it's a neutral way of saying something important. And because it's neutral as possible, but as clear as possible, you're much more likely to be heard.
And you're taking responsibility for your own feelings, aren't you? You're saying,
Yeah.
this is how I feel. This is what I'm feeling. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, you know, observing. So it might be something like when you tell our son, I'm wrong, I feel undermined and upset, and feel that actually we're not working together as
so
parents.
you're acknowledging how it makes you feel, doesn't it? Rather than maybe the bad way would be, you know, you mustn't say that to our son about me, you know, you mustn't do that, you shouldn't do that, or whatever. It allows the focus to then be on the feelings that have been triggered by that. Yeah. Yeah.
Or it may be when I notice that you're, you know, when you say to Johnny that Mum was wrong to take your to say you couldn't watch television, I feel I'm not good enough as a parent. So and then to be saying it would be so helpful, it will help us get a different it will help us get our point over if we can just talk together and work out a strategy so that we're both on the same page and doing the same thing. And
it's also really important, isn't it, sometimes as parents to take that stuff offline, isn't it? You know, you can sometimes see your partner saying something that you might not think is helpful, and just taking a moment to sort of press pause and deal with that as a couple, and then come back to it jointly. And, you know, because you won't always agree on things, but that undermining is quite a negative thing for children to see, isn't it? Yeah.
I think just back to what you were saying earlier about the best way of getting your point across, how to talk. I think the other thing to remember, because sometimes I'm sure you've had this experience where perhaps we'll have a couple who are, one's trying to get the point across, the other's interrupting all the time.
So listening,
absolutely. Absolutely key. And I think sometimes people get a bit muddled and they think, well, if I just sit there listening, they'll think I'm agreeing, but it's not. It's actually getting information.
Yeah, there's a sort of tactic, isn't there, that you can use in counselling sometimes, where you get people to sort of, you know, have an object they hold, and while they're holding it, they're doing the talking, and then they swap it back and forth, so they know that they can't interrupt at that point. But yes, and as long as it's fair and even, you know, it is that, I think that's a really key thing. And often when people are arguing, they're very busy thinking about their response rather than actually what someone's saying to them. So that calmness can give you time to reflect and listen.
Yes.
And a really good tactic for that we use in counselling is, if you've heard somebody say something to you, sometimes to really show you've listened is to repeat it back, isn't it? So yes. I've just heard you say X and Y to me, and that person will then think, yeah, that is what I said to you, and you heard it. Or it might be that they say, well, no, actually that wasn't what I was saying, you heard it like that. And it gives you an opportunity to then, you know, discuss what really is being said, and if you are communicating clearly. Yes. So I think it's probably important to talk a bit about what we can offer at Relate and how people can sort of find that support, isn't it? I mean, obviously, firstly, I would always say to people, go to the Relate website, www.relate.org.uk, and all the information will be there of what to do and how to find support. But what do we do at Relate? That's a good question, isn't it?
Yes, and of course, families come in all shapes and sizes and many different circumstances. So who does Relate provide support for?
Well, yes, some people still think we are the Marriage Guidance Council, and, you know, that's a long time ago we had that title. At Relate, yeah, we offer counselling to individuals, we offer counselling to couples on sort of anything relational. So people often think, you know, my partner won't come, should I still go? And I would always say yes, because we can still look at what's going on for you and you know, look at all the issues. And I think people always find it helpful whether they come alone or as a couple. We see families as well, as we've talked about, of all sort of, you know, shapes and sizes. You know, I've seen adult families where there's been, you know, parents and in-laws. I've seen grown up children with their parents. I've seen teenagers, all sorts. And I think also it's important to say we offer work to young people and to children as well. Quite a lot of work in schools that we do. And people come to us of different ages, different backgrounds, different gender identities, different sexual orientation. You know, we're here for everybody. That's really, you know, important to say. We don't sort of offer adoption counselling. That's not a specialism that we offer, but we offer relationship counselling. And we know about, from a lot of the work we've done, you know, what's sort of specific to some of the adoptive families. And so we've really been focusing in that work on helping couples and families who've been through that process, on looking at the impacts on them and looking at how it's affected their relationships. So I think that's really important.
What are your thoughts about how relationship counselling works?
Well, I mean, people come at all different stages, and I think people often think we're going to solve all their problems, which we're not. And I think the real power of counselling is having the time and the space, having somebody to help facilitate those conversations. I mean, the amount of times I've often heard people say something in the counselling room and their partner look at them and say, I didn't know you thought or felt that. And they say, well, I've been telling you that for years. And there's a real power in hearing your partner say it to a third person. You listen to it. So I think sometimes just having that space, having that opportunity. And counsellors, you know, we're skilled at asking those questions and helping to facilitate people opening up to each other and beginning that communication. And I think, you know, that's what's really important for people to come with an open mind and, you know, want to go on that journey. And often, you know, people sometimes say, how long will I be in counselling? You know, and that's a bit of a how long is a piece of string. But I also think we're not going to solve all the problems. We're hopefully going to help people learn how to solve those problems for themselves. And that's something they can take away from the counselling, isn't it? That doing that. It can be a demanding process because you can, you know, get in touch with things that you might not want to, you know, things from your past. But I think we're always aware of that. And I sometimes think counselling operates at a couple of levels. There might be the here and now about changing strategies, communication, getting people to think about what they need to change now. And then there's some of the deeper stuff that you might want to look at that is about your past and about what you've been through before. And, you know, it's a balance of the two. And some people do a lot of one and some people do a lot of the other, really. So, but it's very much, I think it's something people should see as a strength, because people sometimes think that they're failing if they go and seek help, and that's not the case at all.
And certainly parents who've adopted might worry that coming to counselling is a sign that in some way they've failed. And perhaps because they've been through such a demanding process of having to demonstrate, you know, that they're resilient. But as you were saying, it's not about failure, and coming to counselling doesn't mean you're admitting failure. It just means you want to work on your relationship and that you're willing to put in the effort to deal with issues in a different way. Counselling means beginning not to fail.
And thinking about some of the themes we've said about children and what they see, I've certainly seen couples with teenage children in the past who have, you know, told their children they're going to counselling because they've been at an old enough age and they've explained why they were going out on a Tuesday evening or whatever. And often reported that their children have said, we're really glad you're doing that, Mum and Dad. And again, I think it can be a really positive thing. And for those children, they can see that their parents, they've seen some difficulties, and then they've seen that their parents are actually seeking something to try and resolve them. And that's a really good lesson, I think, to have as an openness in the family, that it's okay to go and get some support from somewhere. You know, I mean, we would do it, wouldn't we? If we broke our arm, we'd go to A&E to X-rayed and put in a cast. And we need to, I think of seeking support, as in counselling for relationship difficulties, in the same light, really. There's a problem and there's a way of fixing it, and you access
that. I think one of the other things to bring out that's important is that our services are confidential.
Yes, yeah.
We won't give your name or any information about you to anyone outside Relate unless someone's personal safety is at risk.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And having a chance to explore complex and difficult issues in the safe and confidential environment where a counsellor isn't there to judge or write reports can be a huge relief for people. It gives a new opportunity to explore safety.
Yeah. And that's certainly true, isn't it, in that adoption process, that everybody you meet is writing a report on you. And so so it can be quite hard to shift to think that this is actually a space for you to explore some feelings. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
So, I mean, this has been a really interesting and useful conversation about some of the recent work that we've done. And I think what we've found from that work, from working with families with adopted children, is that when people do reach out for help, they have found it makes a difference. And it's helped them realise all the strength and resilience that they have. Just how much they've been through, but they have been able to use their strength and their compassion to come through to a different place, and not just the couple be happier, but I've heard so many people who have said it's not just us that are feeling more connected, but actually the children seem happier as well.
That's very true. Yeah. I really hope that this has been an interesting and informative clip for you all to watch, and helped you to learn a bit more about Relate and the work we do, and how we can support people. So thank you very much for listening to us both, and don't forget to check our website at www.relate.org.uk if you want any further details of the work we do and some useful resources. Thank you.